The Mystery of 6 Murders, and The Vanishing Killer. HINTERKAIFECK, Germany, the night of March 31st, 1922, about 70 kilometers from Munich, stood a small, isolated farm known as HINTERKAIFECK. It was home to 6 people. In the span of a single night, the entire family was murdered. There were no witnesses, no confession, no one was ever convicted. More than a century has passed, yet HINTERKAIFECK remains one of Germany's most baffling, unsolved murder cases. But what turned HINTERKAIFECK into a legend wasn't just the murder of 6 people. It was what happened after they were dead. Someone stayed in the house for at least several days, and every piece of evidence points to that unsettling conclusion. The isolated farm. At the beginning of the 20th century, Bavaria was largely rural. Farms were scattered across the countryside, separated by open fields and dense forests. HINTERKAIFECK was one of them. The nearest neighboring farm was several hundred meters away. If someone cried for help in the middle of the night, no one would have heard them. 6 people lived on the farm. The head of the household was Andreas Gruber, a 63-year-old farmer. He was known as a harsh, short-tempered man who kept to himself. His wife was Cecilia Gruber. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, also lived on the farm. So did Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The 6th resident was Maria Baumgartner. She had arrived to work as the family's maid on the very day the murders took place. It was both her first and her last day at HINTERKAIFECK. Strange signs before the tragedy. In the days leading up to the murders, Andreas told his neighbors that he had discovered a set of footprints in the snow. What made them so unsettling was that they led from the forest to the farmhouse, but there were no footprints leading back. He also began hearing strange noises coming from the attic. At first, he believed someone might be hiding up there. He searched the attic, but found no one. On another day, he came across a newspaper he had never seen before. No one in the family had purchased it. Then, a set of house keys went missing. They were never found again. Another detail would later draw investigators' attention. The family's previous maid had quit just a few months earlier. Her reason sounded bizarre. She claimed the farmhouse was haunted. At night, she often heard footsteps, someone walking across the ceiling above her. At the time, no one believed her. But after the murders, many people began to look back at her story very differently. The night of March 31st. No one knows exactly what happened that night. Everything investigators reconstructed was based on the crime scene and the evidence left behind. It appears the killer lured the family members into the barn one by one. First came Andreas, then his wife. Next was Victoria, and finally, young Cecilia. One by one, none of them escaped. None of them had the chance to raise an alarm. Investigators believe the murder weapon was a mattock, a farming tool commonly used on rural properties at the time. Each victim suffered multiple devastating blows to the head. After killing the 4 victims in the barn, the killer entered the farmhouse. Maria was asleep. She was murdered in her bed. The final victim was little Joseph, just 2 years old. He, too, was spared no mercy. By the end of the night, all 6 members of the household were dead. What made this case so unusual? Normally, after committing a murder, the killer flees the scene as quickly as possible. But HINTERKAIFECK was different. When neighbors came to check on the farm several days later, they found that the livestock had been fed. The kitchen showed signs of recent use. Smoke had risen from the chimney. The family dog had been cared for. Fresh bread had been sliced. Meals had been prepared. All of it pointed to one disturbing conclusion. Someone had remained on the farm after the murders, not for a few hours, but possibly for 2 to 4 days. This became one of the most baffling aspects of the entire investigation. If the killer's only motive was murder, why stay? If robbery was the motive, why leave behind so many valuables? And if the killer feared being caught, remaining at the crime scene would only have increased that risk more than a century later. No explanation has fully accounted for this chilling behavior. What the crime scene revealed. The investigation in 1922 faced severe limitations from the very beginning. The crime scene was never properly secured. Neighbors walked freely through the farmhouse. Many people touched the victims' bodies. Some pieces of evidence were moved before investigators could examine them. At the time, modern forensic science was still in its infancy. Techniques such as DNA analysis did not exist, and fingerprint evidence was rarely collected or preserved. With today's standards, as a result, an enormous amount of valuable evidence was lost. Even the victims' bodies were examined inside the barn before being removed from the property. By modern investigative standards, the crime scene had been almost completely compromised. Theory 1. A personal motive. To this day, many investigators and criminologists consider this the most likely theory. The killer appeared to know the farm intimately. They knew the layout of the house. They understood the family's daily routines, and they seemed to know exactly how to isolate each victim. Most telling of all, the decision to remain on the property for several days suggests an extraordinary level of confidence, almost as if the killer felt completely at home there. If this had been the work of a random robber, that behavior would have made very little sense. Theory 2. Someone who had worked at the farm. Several suspects were individuals who had either worked for the family or were otherwise familiar with them. They knew the layout of the house. They knew where tools were stored, and they understood the paths in and out of the property. Some of them were also reported to have had conflicts with Andreas Gruber. However, none of them were ever formally charged, and no direct evidence was ever found linking any of them to the crime. Theory 3. The family's secret. This is the most controversial line of investigation in the entire case. Andreas Gruber had previously been convicted in court for incest involving his own daughter, Victoria. At the time, it was a major scandal in the community. Many investigators later believed that this deeply troubled family dynamic could have played a role in the murders. There were also persistent rumors surrounding the true paternity of baby Joseph. Some suspected Andreas himself. Others pointed to men who had been involved with Victoria. If any of these rumors were true, a motive rooted in revenge or personal conflict becomes entirely plausible. However, to this day, there is no evidence strong enough to confirm any of these theories. Why the case remains unsolved. Over 100 suspects have been investigated over the years. Some even confessed, only to later retract their statements. Others were dismissed due to solid alibis. Many were identified based on rumor rather than evidence. Decades later, German authorities repeatedly reopened the case file. Even academic institutions analyzed the original records using modern investigative methods. The conclusions were remarkably consistent. One suspect stood out as more plausible than the rest. However, the legal threshold for proof was never met. As a result, the identity of the killer was never officially confirmed. The legacy of HINTERKAIFECK. What makes this case endure for more than a century is not its brutality. History has witnessed massacres far more horrific. What sets HINTERKAIFECK apart is the sense of unease it left behind. A farmhouse, standing alone in the middle of open fields. A family that seemed to sense something was wrong long before it happened. Footprints with no return path. Strange noises in the attic. And a killer who may have lived alongside the victims after their deaths for several days. Even today, the HINTERKAIFECK case remains unsolved. The identity of the perpetrator may have been lost to time forever. But it is this silence that has turned HINTERKAIFECK into one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. And perhaps that is why, more than 100 years later, the name HINTERKAIFECK continues to appear in every list of the world's greatest unsolved crimes.